Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. So glad you could join us. And if you're watching us on YouTube, you can also listen to us wherever fine podcasts are found. And if you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, you can also watch us if you want to see what I look like, see what my guests look like. Check us out on YouTube as well. And please subscribe, leave a review, and let your friends know and your family members know and your friends' family members know, et cetera, et cetera. Joining me today is a gentleman named Kerry White. He's a recognized figure in Montana politics, known for his dedication to land use rights and responsible resource management. Born and raised in Montana, White's personal and professional life has been deeply rooted in the state's rich history and its unique environmental challenges. White's journey in the Montana legislature reflects his commitment to local governance and his understanding of the challenges faced by Montanans. Throughout his tenure, he has worked on a range of issues, but his primary focus has often revolved around land and resource management, environmental policies, and ensuring the rights of Montana citizens. Perhaps one of the most significant aspects of White's career has been his association with Citizens for Balanced Use. As president of CBU, he worked towards promoting a balanced approach to land and resource use, ensuring that conservation efforts coexist with economic viability and public access. The organization aims to foster cooperation between land users, conservationists, and public land agencies, and under White's leadership, Citizens for Balanced Use has advocated for policies that represent the widest range of stakeholders. Kerry, so glad you could join us here on the Lunch Hour, and let's start here. I don't think people back east or people in the big cities just understand how much land the federal government owns in states like Montana, the states of the West. How much land does the federal government own? How does it impact local land use decision-making?
Just in the state of Montana, 40% of the land mass is controlled by the federal agencies, whether it be Forest Service or BLM. Not as much as, say, Utah, where it's 80 to 90% federally managed. Under FLTMA back in 1976, it was transferred. They call it ownership by federal land agencies. But really, they are the land managers for the people of the land.
That's an important distinction in the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of '76. Actually, something. Let's go back into history, because you and I have trod over some of the same ground here. And I know I sent you a copy of a tweet that I just sent out last week before you and I had traded messages on the issue of state enabling acts and the issue of federal land ownership and control. You and I did some research into this back in the 1990s, working on a court case with a lawyer I was working with about Nye County, Nevada, the third largest county in the United States. You and I both came to the same conclusion, that these states joined the union with an understanding that the unappropriated public lands within their midst were going to be disposed of by the federal government. The feds hung on to it, and this is where we are now. Talk about this issue and the abrogation of the responsibility on the part of the feds in terms of disposing of this land, and why that's important.
Well, the Bureau of Land Management was a land disposal agency when the homesteaders came out west and staked out 80 acres, 160 acres. And then had to improve that land and work that land and ultimately be able to own that land. There was a lot of land that was undisposed of, not homesteaded. And when Montana came in and many western states, I call it west of the Mississippi River,
right?
When those states came in late, we weren't clear back in the early formation of the original 13 states, colonies, whatever. We came in late to the game. We were supposed to have that land disposed of to the citizens within those states. And that never occurred. The federal government held on to it for one reason or another. I think some of it had to do with the mineral reserves.
Sure.
And the reserves that were there, whether it was timber reserves, it could have been the water. But anyway, BLM. And then in 1905, the Forest Service came in, 1905, 1906, and then put in the forest reserves. and those were reserved, but it was still public land to be used for the benefit of the citizens, and that was for resource, for mining, for timber. I remember Senator Conrad Burns, he was representing Montana back then. He said there's no difference from growing corn to growing timber.
Right.
But in the 70s, the environmental movement started. And then under Nixon, when we got the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, all of these are being used by the environmentalists to stop resource development, to stop active management. And so when the fires come, which I think the East Coast experienced some of those fires, New York City and the smoke.
Oh, yeah.
That's what we breathe every summer out here, because we absolutely cannot cut timber. Montana right now is experiencing about 70% of our proposed timber sales in the state of Montana are under litigation right now. We are in the Ninth Circuit, which is a liberal court. And so the environmentalists sue under issues of the Endangered Species Act or Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act. And then they turned it into a business model through the Equal Access to Justice Act, which they get paid to litigate.
Yes. And it's interesting to me, as I pointed out to a member of Congress, again, about almost 20 years ago now, I will never forget this. And I pointed out, I said, if the federal government was not going to, cut timber on Forest Service lands, those lands wouldn't be managed under the Department of Agriculture. Right. Exactly. There's a reason why it's there. She never thought of it quite in that way. It was quite the moment when I pointed that out to her. But that's just it. This is part of the problem. You're in Montana. You experience this all the time. You have lands that are being managed for folks who have parochial interests who may never set foot in Montana, but they like the idea of it being out there. And these folks don't distinguish between lands that might be managed by the U.S. Forest Service. They think that every piece of federally owned land is a national park and should be protected indefinitely. This is not the case, is it?
No, not at all. You have national monuments, which are designated. You have national parks. You have wildlife management areas. And then you have Forest Service. They have different, roadless area. In 2001, Clinton passed the 2001 roadless rule. Yeah. That was a blanket designation nationwide. And most of this land was not roadless. But because of the scope and the size of that designation, the Forest Service currently is working to remove roads within those roadless areas.
Wow.
To turn them into roadless.
Yeah.
And therefore, we are losing the ability to manage the timber, and we're losing the ability to access those public lands. We have an aging population. They need some sort of transportation. I get angry at watching advertisements from the car companies about, buy a new truck or a new, SUV and go experience the wilderness. You can't take motorized. You cannot ride a bicycle. You can't take a wheelbarrow or a game cart. It's mechanized into a wilderness area. In fact, national parks are more lenient management than wilderness areas. Wilderness is hands off.
It's interesting because we've seen this sort of play out in other areas down in Arizona, right? You have Raul Grijalva, who's calling for greater wilderness areas on the border, essentially creating corridors that can't even be patrolled, that allow folks to sort of come right across the border through these wilderness areas. You had the situation also in Arizona where I want to say it wasn't the town of Tombstone. Maybe it was Tombstone. It was right outside of Tombstone where the water pipe connecting the town's water supply was broken and it couldn't get fixed. They had to create a bucket brigade. I mean, right? I mean, you know about this. Talk a little bit about these situations where
wild and scenic river designation is another one. We had a big flood up here that came down, and I think you probably saw in the news the house that fell into the Yellowstone River outside of Gardner, Montana last year. But it flooded the East Rosebud River, and the road and the bridges, the access in there was destroyed.
Yeah.
In a wild and scenic river corridor, it really is very difficult, if at all possible, to rebuild that infrastructure in that wild and scenic corridor because it's supposed to be left in a natural state.
Well, this is how I came to these issues, because we were working with Nye County in Nevada, the third largest county in the United States, the size of Vermont, New Hampshire combined, 93% federally owned. And there was a road that got washed out on a National Forest Service in the Toyabe National Forest. It was causing folks to have to go 200 miles out of their way to get from one city to another one. And finally, the county commissioners got so frustrated with the lack of action from the Interior Department that a county commissioner got on a bulldozer and bulldozed open the road. And anyway, there's a whole long and involved story, but that's how I came to sort of understand these things and these issues. And again, right, so more and more acreage is being turned over. This is how you came to this. I mean, how does this impact your average small town, right? We all know that there are tourist destinations in Montana, Bozeman or Red Lodge or Helena or wherever, but the smaller towns, how does this impact them, their ability to survive, not thrive, but just survive?
Well, I think it would be like a West Coast dock where you were accepting shipping, and that drove the economy of that community, and they took away the shipping.
Wow.
In Montana, a lot of communities in the western part of the state especially were formed around timber.
Yeah.
And the production of timber, which is a growing resource. I want folks to know that it's not stagnant. It's a dynamic resource that needs to be managed. I tell people, you got a tree in your backyard and half of it's dead or it dies, you would want to remove it. But out here, they won't even let us remove those dead trees. If it burns, a catastrophic fire, maybe we got 100,000 acre fire, the state goes in and does salvage logging, or if it's on private land, they do salvage logging within a year. The Forest Service doesn't do that. It takes them 3 to 5 to 7 years to go through NEPA, and then you have no value of the product. A lot of these small communities were built on mining, and we've lost our mining. We haven't permitted a new mine in the state of Montana for 30 years because of the regulations under Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, NEPA regulations. And because of our large amount of federally managed land, all of those federal agencies are the decision makers.
It almost seems like that the environmentalists want to turn these communities into vassal states for the enjoyment of the elites, right? Essentially, you're there. You can no longer do for yourself. You can no longer harvest timber. You can no longer extract minerals. You can no longer extract petroleum. No. The way you're going to make your money is by serving the folks the rich people who are going to come visit you. I mean, am I wrong in that interpretation?
No, I mean, the service industry is not high-paying jobs.
Right.
And, you talk about, well, we're going to have affordable housing. If the housing demand is greater than the supply and the housing price goes up, the people in the service industry cannot afford to live there to service the people that are coming here to enjoy, what we have. The resource industry, on the other hand, is an industry that's very high paying, good paying jobs, and provides a product for people to consume. Say your timber, anybody's going to build a house. If you're going to pour any concrete or pour any gravel or cinder block or anything, masonry or anything, you got to have gravel, and all of that is mining. Yeah. The thing is, you either grow it or you mine it, because things don't come from thin air. Right. It just doesn't come out of thin air. So what people forget is, I want a cell phone, but I don't want you to get the gold and silver out of the ground to make my cell phone. I want solar panels, but I don't, and I want electric cars, but I don't want the things to make the batteries, the cobalt and stuff like that. So all of that needs to come from Mother Earth, and we can do it in a responsible way. The environmentalists hold up the Berkeley pit viewed as, how we've destroyed the environment and everything. That was over 100 years ago.
Right.
We don't do things that way anymore. We don't
And-
cut timber the way we did before, clear cuts and stuff like that. We selective cut. We do a great job at these timber companies, but we had 100 timber mills in the state of Montana. We're down to 5, Andrew,
Wow.
in the state of Montana. So what happens, like Colorado, that they have a big burn and they want salvage logging and they put it out for bid. They get one bid out of a company out of Texas.
Right.
And they say, okay, go ahead, you can have the bid. And Texas goes, well, you don't understand. This is not what we're paying you. This is what you're paying us to come get it.
Right. That's
when you lose your infrastructure to treat, you're out of luck.
Well, this gets into so many other things where we've got this regulatory regime. It drives industries out, and we lose that core competency in terms of doing these things. I'm going to take a step back to the forest science part of it for a second, because I don't think people understand what happens when you have overgrowth in these forests and what that means in terms of fires and what that means in terms of the viability of the soil moving forward. Talk a little bit about that, about what essentially how it's like dropping a thermite bomb on a piece of forest land when that burns.
These are really unnatural fires. I go back to the Native Americans back before the white settlers came out here. They actually started fires and opened up the canopy for the wildlife so that there was meadows and stuff.
Yeah.
Since we haven't been able to do that and create this opening in the canopy and take out the dead, diseased, and dying timber, what we find is 100 times the amount of trees per acre that would be in a healthy forest. So what happens to the wildlife that doesn't have anything to eat because the forest floor is nothing but pine needles and dead branches and downfall? They move off of the public land and the forested land, and where do they go? We're seeing in Montana a 17% increase in ungulates. I'm talking deer and elk, moving off of the public land, forested land, onto private property. What does that do to the farmer or the rancher? It decreases his profitability. It causes damage to maybe irrigation facilities and fences. And so he has more expense and more hardship on the farmer and the rancher. And I go back to the farmer and the rancher are the ones that are putting food on the table. And we're putting more pressure on them. But I don't think it's any secret that they want to remove the farmer and the rancher. They don't like cows grazing. It just kind of snowball effect, so to speak.
Absolutely. But let's talk about this, because we'll talk about Citizens for Balanced Use and the pushback that you guys get. I don't know if you want to talk about the harassment that you guys have undergone, but let's start with this idea, which is all you are talking about is balancing the use, right? You have to have some balancing of interest. Everybody here in America has they have a competing interest. They have an interest in something that they want to do. We have so much land there. There should be a balancing of interests that are out there. But the other side doesn't want that. They want to shut everything out. Talk about what balanced use means to you and your organization, and then we'll talk a little bit about the harassment you guys have undergone.
Well, I think, what our organization does is, like, we would like to have the opportunity for people to enjoy, recreate, and experience the outdoors. And that's in the public lands in Montana. And that's why a lot of people come here. I mean, we get calls all the time. There was a road or an access or a trail that I used to go with my dad, with my grandfather, and now it's gated or it's obliterated. They use what they call a rip, slash, and seed. They rip up the road bed, they throw slash and down trees over the trail or road, and then they throw some seed on there. And within a couple of years, that access is gone. They've removed it from the map. So a balance to us, say 50-50, that would be very nice.
Sure.
But every time that the Forest Service goes through a forest plan revision, and you can see the map behind me shows some trails that they've left open. Yellow ones are open, then they close the blue ones.
Sure.
So, but what we had before they came out with this plan was probably a map with double that amount of access on it. Yeah. So every time they do a plan, the the non-motorized or the environmentalists, they never lose.
Right.
It's the motorized and the mechanized side that always gives up just incrementally a little more, a little more. It's kind of like the boiling frog.
Sure.
Put him in cold water. At the end of the day, he's boiled and he didn't even know it.
And this gets into the idea of they're always going incremental. They always want a little bit more. And there really is no end. I have a moment of personal privilege here, Kerry.
Okay.
The Meeteetse Trail extending from Red Lodge, Montana to Meeteetse, Wyoming, or vice versa. Is that still open?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right.
I will say that. Yeah.
Me being on the East Coast, but it's something my aging father. It's still a fantasy of mine to be able to take him, because he did his graduate field work in the Beartooth Primitive, and so he and I have talked quite a bit about going and doing the Meeteetse Trail, because that's sort of
I don't know if you just saw one of our board members of CBU sent me yesterday a proposal that's come out where they want to expand Yellowstone National Park.
Okay. I'm not surprised at this,
Well,
especially given
surrounding the park is private land. So do you just tell these people we're expanding the park and you no longer have your 150 years of history and ownership of this property? We're taking it.
Right.
It's mind-boggling to me.
Well, this gets into the work that Chuck Cushman and Ron Arnold did, back in the 90s, right? And the video that they produced, Big Park. And this gets into the issue of easements and condemnation blight, right? I think you can speak to this, the idea of someone puts this on a map somewhere, all of a sudden your property values plummet. All of a sudden the Nature Conservancy shows up and says, well, hey, your land is now worth a tenth of what it was before. We'll take it off your hands. Talk a little bit about how this works.
Well, the conservation easements, I actually brought a bill during legislature that would have taxed the value of the conservation easement. Now, you have a bundle of property rights. You might have mineral rights. You might have water rights. You've got property rights. And with that bundle is the right to develop. I mean, you have a right to an expectation of what your investment will return for you. It's in the Constitution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which was ownership of private property.
Oh, yeah.
But they want to peel off this development right. And I introduced a bill that said that development right has a value. Of course it has a value. A lot of times more value than the land is agriculture in many cases, depending on where it's located. And I said that should be taxed. And oh my gosh, they come out of the woodwork. They thought I was, a lunatic out there for, you can't, tax an intangible property, because the development right is not a tangible asset, but it is, and the reason it is because say you have operating capital loan with the bank,
right,
and you put a conservation easement on your property, and you want to renew that loan, or you want to increase that loan. Maybe you need a new $1 million combine, a $750,000 tractor, or whatever, and the bank looks at it and goes, well, the value of your property that we risk assessment and gave you money on was valued with the development rights at a value of maybe $30,000 an acre that we could recover if you defaulted on your loan. Now with the conservation easement on there, and they've taken away the development right, which could be the Nature Conservancy or a land trust or whatever, then now your land is not worth what the bank loaned you. And you're not going to get a capital loan. And now maybe you can't, or your operation, you might have to sell the land. The conservation groups, the land trusts, actually track foreclosures and people that are in problems financially with banking institutions. And the other thing that they track is obituaries. Yeah. So if your spouse dies, you're an elderly couple and one of the spouse dies. I had a neighbor that called me up in tears. The land trust was on her door 2 days after her husband passed away. Before his funeral, telling her the only way for her to keep that ranch was to put it in a conservation easement. And I went over there and told her the pros and cons, and I said, it's up to you, but I wouldn't do it because you become a subservient, you become a leasee of the land, because the conservation organization can come in and inspect your land and tell you you have to do some sort of improvement, and you have to pay for it. Whatever they tell you, you need to do. It's in the contract. I've read many of them.
The left has been all over the concept of the reverse mortgage and how reverse mortgages are ostensibly taking advantage of seniors, and yet obviously very, very silent on this because it appears. So let me ask you about the situation in Yellowstone. I mean, what has anybody asked the Department of the Interior? Well, I mean, are you gonna pay for this land? Are you good? How are you gonna absorb this land? What's the skinny out there in Montana?
Well, one of our board members, Stacy Bragg, sent me the article yesterday. I'm actually right now. I'm in northern North Dakota in the Bakken.
Okay.
Because what's going on up there is the oil companies are putting in pipelines across private property and offering pennies on the dollar, very little compensation, if any, to put these pipelines on in. They're not pursuing eminent domain. So it's another attack on private property. But I only mention that because I haven't had a chance to read the article, how far they are along with expanding Yellowstone parks. Stacy just sent me an email and said, check this out. They always wanted to remove people from the land, and here's another effort to do it.
You know, it's on the issue of pipelines. I've never received any money from any of the Koch foundations or the Koch industries, but I will point out that when the Kochs built their pipeline network, they never engaged in any kind of private-to-private eminent domain. They always negotiated in good faith with the landowners to build those things. And it's funny because there was a moment where I don't know if you're familiar with the work of R.J. Smith. He was a scholar at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, private property rights guy, used to excoriate me when I sort of moved away and was no longer working exclusively on property rights issues. RJ would take me to task for having formerly been in favor of property rights. I've never lost my passion and protection of private property rights. But we were at an event, and a scholar with the NRDC got up to say something to RJ about this claim about the Koch brothers and the pipelines, and we all thought he was going to finally have proved RJ wrong. No, he said, I had to finally admit that what you said about the Koch brothers was absolutely right. So, I mean, let me go back to this, Kerry, which is this issue is not going to get better. It's going to get worse. Actually, before we get to how we solve this problem, you have raised the issue. And because you are a prominent person, because you were in the legislature and you know how to effectively get things done, you've raised the ire of a lot of folks on the left. You guys found yourselves the target of harassment by folks in Washington, D.C. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, we're a 501c3.
Right.
And we file our 1099s every year. We had a organization out in Washington, D.C., which lists, they're a nonprofit too. They're supposed to have a physical address, but we had some people out there that went and looked at their physical address. It's a bank of mailboxes, post office boxes. They don't have a physical address, yet the IRS allows them to continue operating as a 501c3. But they accused us of falsifying or incomplete or incorrect 1099 form for our IRS filing, and so we had to defend that.
Yeah,
and we have a bookkeeper, a CPA, fully versed in nonprofits. We're on the up and up. We file them on time every year, but it takes time when you get the letter stating that there's a complaint against you, and now you have to try to defend yourself against that. But it was basically harassment.
Right. And let's be really clear here. You're an organization, a 501c3 organization is the other side likes to say, well, these are supposed to be social welfare organizations. Well, guess what? In the Internal Revenue Code, research and education, and frankly, to a certain degree, advocacy is a social welfare permitted, operation of an organization like Citizens for Balanced Use. And so the idea that somehow you were doing something that was not above board because you were engaging in your core mission, which is to educate people and frankly to educate legislators about this thing. I will never forget. I'm sorry, Kerry, for monopolizing here.
Go ahead.
Having a conversation up on Capitol Hill back when, frankly, then Senator John McCain, wanted to crack down on this kind of work. And I said to a McCain staffer and several others, none of us engages in research and education for research and education's sake. We all are trying to change the world in some way. And certainly Citizens for Balanced Use is well within its rights to do that. So let's talk about what a perfect world looks like. How do we educate the public better about these things? How do we make it so that we're not losing, access to these lands a little step at a time?
Well, I think our mission statement on our website basically says it all. We're advocating for multiple use recreation, which is all forms of recreation. We don't care if you're, a bicycle rider or a hiker or cross-country skier or snowmobiler or motorcycle, all these different things and what new technology is coming down the road. But we have access, points of access in the West and trails and road infrastructure that was paid for, the majority of it, by tax dollars. And the federal government, in my mind, really doesn't have a right to tear out infrastructure that was paid for by tax dollars. And this provides a real, in times of turmoil, which I believe we're in right now, it provides a social escape,
right?
Mental wellness and health. So we're trying to educate people on the value of recreating and getting out into the backcountry. But most people, as an aging population that we are, need some form of transportation. The other thing we advocate for is active forest management. We saw the Rice Ridge fire up at Seeley Lake. 2 years later, those folks are still experiencing reduced lung efficiency because of the crystalline silica and the carcinogens that are contained in these wildfire smokes.
Wow.
And there's studies that are out there, exposure to wildfire smoke and everything that's in it, formaldehydes and all these deadly carcinogens that are in it. And it's in the air and everybody breathes it. And if you want to wear a mask isn't going to do it. The N95 mask isn't going to do it, just like the COVID. That was a hoax on the mask. And then the last thing is responsible development of our natural resources in mining, because everything you use in your daily life, anything that's made of plastic, that's oil.
Right.
Anything that rotates around under your car or bicycle, like in a tire, that's oil.
Right.
Anything you use in medication or anything you use in makeup, it's oil. It's oil based, and so people need to understand, and I kind of get a kick out of people that I think Jay Leno had, jaywalking or whatever.
Oh, yes.
And he says, where does your food come from? And people on the street were saying, well, the grocery store.
The store.
Well,
sure.
You got to understand that's not the truth. So we've lost a lot of the agriculture education in our schools that taught people where your food comes from.
Right.
And so CBU, we're just in education, and it's almost like the environmentalists and the people that attack us don't want us to share our knowledge with the general public and educate them on what's happening and how they can make a difference.
Well, I appreciate that, Kerry. How do folks find out more information about the good work that you guys are doing?
Our website is balanceduse.org. We also have a Facebook, Citizens for Balanced Use, and you can join. Our organization is free to join. We have over 7,000 active members, about 100,000 members and supporters through our supporting organizations. We got 68 supporting organizations. And we go all over the Northwest. We have clubs that we've helped start in Washington, Idaho, Oregon, Wyoming. But anyway, it's free to join, and you'll get our email updates on how you can get involved with links on how you can comment on certain projects, contacts with the agencies and stuff. It's just education to put out there to try to inform folks in an easy, simple way on what you can do to get involved.
Well, listen, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, when anybody goes out and searches for information on something, a lot of times you're overwhelmed and you don't really know where to go and where's the link and how do I comment on this and who do I contact and who are my legislators, and so we just try to provide that information. And then if you contact us, if we can help you in any way, help you get in touch with an agency and or talk to the agency for you, help you form a group, we're more than willing, to try to help folks get engage. That's what we're doing.
I appreciate that. Kerry White, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. This has been yet another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Please subscribe, like it, let us know what you think about it. Leave a review. Tell your friends, tell your family members. I am your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.